Good morning and welcome. I'm Daphne Richards, Travis County Horticulture Agent with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Thank you for joining us for this webinar and our Texas Tough Plants series. We have a great program lined up for you today, Native Landscapes for Wildlife. As part of this program, our presenter may refer to various source materials or websites. Don't panic if you don't catch those in time to write them down. Please just relax and enjoy the webinar. All registrants will receive a follow-up email chock full of great stuff, including a link to the recorded session and links to any references or resources listed in the presentation. Today, we'll be taking some questions about halfway through the program and again at the end of the session. To pose a question, you'll need to use the Q&A feature. Simply type in your question at any point during the presentation, and we'll address them at 2 times, during the mid-program break and again at the end. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can, and any that we don't get to, we'll follow up after the program with you about. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming our presenter, John Davis, Conservation Program Coordinator for Austin Parks and Recreation. We'll be covering the aspects of wildlife habitat and how to create them in your own garden. A special focus will be placed on the value that native plants provide in food and shelter for our wildlife. John, I'm so excited for you to be here today and to learn more from you about gardening for wildlife habitat. So the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Daphne. It's a joy to be here. Thank you, everybody who's online. Let me get started by sharing my screen. All right. Let's see. It says participants can now see my screen, but I can't see y'all. Can someone let me? Okay, Daphne, thank you for that thumbs up. All right. So my name is John Davis. For about 30 years, I worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And about 2 years ago, I retired because I got an offer I couldn't refuse to come to work for the city of Austin. So I'm a wildlife biologist for the city of Austin now, and I work in the preserve system. But as part of that job, I'm the Wildlife Austin Program Coordinator. And that's why I'm here today to talk to you about landscaping for wildlife. And as part of this presentation, we're going to be looking at big changes that happen kind of on a daily basis here. And then we're going to talk about what we can do, what all of us can do to kind of reverse some of those changes or those impacts. But if you just look around the Austin area, you'll see on a day-to-day basis, parcels of land changing little by little, parcel by parcel. Yes, Daphne?
Presentation mode on your PowerPoint.
Okay, so you're seeing the part that I'm doing this now?
Yeah, and I'm seeing your side.
Okay.
I'm seeing it in edit mode.
All right. Well, so all right, let's see.
Down at the bottom.
Yeah. Well,
No.
so I did that.
There we go.
And it should shift over to this other screen, is it not?
No, let's see.
Okay. Well, let me try and share again.
Start the slideshow.
See, I have the slideshow going. We did this. Let me try and share this again.
And as usual, we practiced, and then it does the way it did in practice.
Well, let me see if I'm going to do this, and maybe it will.
There we go.
Change that. Okay, so y'all are seeing this one now, right? Changing parcel by parcel.
Beautiful presentation. Right. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Daphne, for rescuing me and not letting me go 10 slides before you jumped in. So we see the landscape changing parcel by parcel when we look all around. And so as this change happens, I use wildlife populations as kind of the canary in the coal mine to tell me if these changes are positive or negative. That's my value judgment because I love wildlife. And so I use wildlife populations as that kind of proverbial canary in the coal mine. And as we analyze this issue, we're going to look at three main things. First of all, we're going to talk in more detail about what's happening. We're going to look at the impacts on wildlife populations, as I said, but then we're going to spend most of our time on what you can do about it. So what's happening? Well, every day, land that provides food, water, shelter for wildlife in the Austin area gets cleared, maybe gets altered, but in many cases gets completely scraped clean of its vegetation. And sometimes it's all just for another big shopping center, ladies and gentlemen, which ends up looking something like this. Now, I go to shopping centers, but this is clearly not what was on the landscape before. And as this process happens, this process or even this process, where we have lots of homes being built. I live in a home myself, but this land does not look like in this photograph what it looked like before. And so what I want to talk about is kind of what that process is and what are some of the impacts to local ecosystems, local natural resources as that process progresses. So let's start from the very basic bottom line: soil. As we develop, in a traditional sense, soil undergoes lots of different changes, and a lot of people don't think about that. But first of all, this slide right here shows all of these impacts, with the exception maybe of erosion. But if you look at soil during the construction phase, soil gets compacted pretty heavily. You can see that right here. You can see compaction all around this home site. You see soil being removed. So a lot of this is graded, and so much of the soil has been removed. You even see that there's been a lot of stuff piled up back here. It's exposed to ultraviolet radiation. And so as you expose soil to ultraviolet radiation, it changes the microflora and fauna in the actual soil itself. So soil isn't dirt. Dirt is the inorganic, non-life structure that we find in soil. Soil includes not just that structure, but all the living things that live in the soil as well. And UV exposure can change that, can kill much of those species. Exposed soil, of course, then undergoes erosive processes, and then in some cases it's entirely replaced. I want you to look at this slide right here. You see this little top part, just about 6 or 8 inches in this particular part where this development is happening. In other parts of Tarrant County, Travis County, you get much deeper soils, but this one, you see that top layer is the organic rich layer. And you can see it's pretty thin here, but you see much of what's all around this now, that soil is being replaced. And so when this home is finished, all this will be kind of graded out, and then there will be turf put on top, and you'll really never know what's kind of under there. You won't really know in the finished product all the impacts to the soil. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. When I worked for many years up in Dallas, Fort Worth, I did a presentation kind of like this. And I had a homeowner come up to me after the presentation and said, John, I had this spot in my yard that never seemed to grow anything well. The grass never grew well there. I tried to plant stuff, tried to do a bed, nothing ever went there, nothing ever did well. So we decided to just kind of scrape everything off, thinking maybe there was a spill, some sort of chemical spill that happened. We decided to kind of scrape everything off and try to start over. And when we did that, we found all the construction debris from our home, all the stuff there was a hole dug, and they pushed it all in that hole, and they covered it with like a little thin layer of soil and put turf on top of it. So you never know. That's a bad practice. I don't know that all developers do that. I don't even know that many do that, but this particular person had a developer that did that. So you never know the impacts to the soil during that process. So vegetation doesn't get off easily either. I showed you in previous slides where the vegetation gets completely scraped off in most developments. In some it doesn't, but in most it does. And we have the opportunity, especially for homeowners, when we put our home there, that we can replace a lot of that native vegetation if we choose to do so. However, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, in my opinion, not uncommon to see a landscape like you see on your screen that is basically full of non-native species, exotic species. There are some native species here. This is some live oak right back here. You can see in the background this tree. And these are Yaupon hollies, although if you don't know, they don't grow that way in the wild. I suspect y'all knew that. But aside from that, pretty much all this is exotic. It's not a native species. And these non-native species don't provide for food like the native species do. Sure, you might have a couple of native species that will go and visit, crepe myrtles, et cetera. But for the most part, native exotic species and plants don't feed our native species of wildlife, our pollinators, et cetera. So we have an opportunity here to reduce the impact, but oftentimes we don't. And so we end up with a situation that's kind of radically different. So similarly, in nature, you'll have the canopy that you see here, and you typically have a mid-story that you see in this level, and then you'll have an understory that grows under trees, and then you have the forest floor layer, which is down here, which is covered in deep, thick, rich organic leaf litter, or leaves, let's say that. Litter is sometimes, I call it leaf litter. It may be a term people don't like, but when we typically urbanize an area, you see this pattern. You see a tree being left, all the other being removed, and then all of this ground layer being replaced with turf. So the woodland structure is completely changed from what it was in the beginning. And in this process, through this vegetative change that we put our land through, we see a decrease in our specialists. We see things like Turk's cap begin to decline. We see prairie celestials less and less. We see bluebells less and less. And I could just go on and on about the different native plants that we're seeing less and less of on the landscape. But the really troubling thing is we see a pretty radical increase in problem exotic species. Now, an exotic species is a species that was brought over by human beings from somewhere else. Most of our exotic plants that are in our landscapes come from Asia, Europe, or South America. And they're brought over because they look pretty or for one reason or another, and they get put in the landscape and then they escape. So you see there Japanese honeysuckle, ligustrum, parrot's feather in the water, nandina, Johnson grass in grasslands. All of these species are I would say the number one problem, if not the number one, within the top 3 problems that we deal with on an ecological basis in our preserves. Our preserves are overrun with exotic species because they escape from people's landscapes and they get established in our preserves. And we spend probably more time and money dealing with this problem than any other ecological problem that we face. So it's huge. Exotic species are a real problem. Now, when we move out of the realm of vegetation and we move into the aquatic habitats in urban areas especially, we see lots of impacts there too. We see impacts of pesticides, herbicides, even fertilizers. A lot of times when I tell people this, people say, fertilizers? That's supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to make things grow and it's nutrients, and wow, how can that be a problem? Well, if we were face to face in a group of a big room, I would ask you, and I would ask you to start hollering out answers. But I can't see right now anything that's coming in. And so I'm just going to go ahead and move forward by saying, if you see water that is green pea soup, right here, maybe, that's a nutrient-rich water. And you would think, well, that's not a big deal, but it really is, because what happens is you get these unnatural growths of algal blooms and things like that. And so it ends up being a real problem with water quality. And so we see lots of impacts in our waterways. Those impacts can come from all over the place. They can come from streets. They can come from our gardens. Our yards. It can come from chemical spills from industrial sites, et cetera. But all of these things combine in the runoff as we get rain. The heavy metals coming off of brake pads from cars, the petroleum residue coming off of our streets, all that combines and it gets mixed into our urban water, creating a real water quality problem. But that's not the only real problem with water. There's also a change in water quantity over the normal flow. So if you were to look at a hydrograph, or where you map the flow of a stream, after a stream in a rural area, that stream, after a rain, that stream gradually rises and then gradually goes back down again. If you look at an urban stream with that same rain event, it will immediately be flooding like beyond what it used to flood, and then it will gradually go down to a level lesser than what it was before. That's because of this reduced infiltration, concentrated runoff. And we say it changes the hydrograph, it changes the hydrology of an urban system, so that our urban streams, as you see on the screen here, are having to deal with more problems now than ever before. So you see, this is the same stream. The picture on the left is taken right after a rain. The picture on the right was taken about 3 days after the picture on the left. So you can see the picture on the right. Here's that concrete step down that you see over here. This tree is falling in. This tree is floating downstream as I took this picture. I couldn't believe it. And I went back 3 days later again, and you can just see the massive amount of damage that is done. And so that's when you see scouring. Scouring is where it's digging in. No, scouring is where it's digging out, sorry. Incising is digging down, and then widening is where the whole floodplain has to widen to accommodate the amount of water we're asking it to carry now. I always like to say the water remembers. The water remembers what it's supposed to do. And so if you have a floodplain that's not holding, it doesn't have enough room to hold all the water remembers, and it's going to widen that floodplain to do what it needs to do. So in the end, when you wrap all this up, you end up with, on the left, an urban habitat that's possibly completely altered, nothing like before. Or maybe sometimes lesser than that, you have a habitat that's simplified. Maybe there's some stuff there, maybe not. There's some still greenery there, but still overall quite simplified. So from now on, we're going to look at, what is that impact as we measure it in wildlife populations, and then again, how can we change what's happening in the future. So one of the things that we see as we look at all wildlife populations across all groups of species, where there's mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, invertebrates, it doesn't matter. We see the same pattern over and over again after we urbanize. We lose our specialists. Now, specialists are those species that eat very specific things, they live very specific places, or they may have very specific ecological needs. They are specialists, and they tend to decline. Generalists are just the opposite. They can eat anything, pretty much live anywhere. So think of a raccoon, can pretty much eat whatever you want to put in front of it, and they can live anywhere. And so they're a great example of a generalist. And then we also see a pattern that we saw with, with the plants again, all these patterns we saw, but we see exotic species in wildlife increase as we urbanize. So this pattern happens across all groups. And so I don't want to make you think, because I'm focusing on invertebrates for the rest of this little period, I don't want you to think that it's only invertebrates where this happens. It happens across all groups, but I'm going to focus on invertebrates for this main reason. If you've ever read Doug Tallamy, he did Bringing Nature Home, and I think Our Best Hope, some really fantastic books that are out there on the market. He's an entomologist, and he has studied backyard entomology for many years. And what he has found, he actually did the study, it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars for a pair of birds to raise a clutch of eggs on average. Let that sink in. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. So if we're doing something in our landscape that isn't creating a robust amount of our native invertebrates, nothing else is going to thrive. But if we take care of those invertebrates, and if we're creating a habitat that's really creating a robust, healthy ecosystem of invertebrates, everything else can build off of that. So that's why I'm going to really focus on a lot of our invertebrates. They are the basis of the food web, and They are our pollinators. So they really provide a fantastically important part of our ecosystems. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time on butterflies and bees because they really, to me, encapsulate the importance of the invertebrates. And it does it in a way that's just, I think, really interesting. So we do see generalist increase. We see that kind of again, that same pattern. We see exotics increase. Things like German cockroach, the red imported fire ant, the European honeybee, all these are exotic species. They were brought in from somewhere else, sometimes not on purpose, sometimes on purpose. And so I'm going to really focus in on these. And one of the reasons, since I'm going to talk a lot about bees, I really want to drive home the distinction. When I say, normally when most people say bees, they think honeybee. That's what the average person walking the street thinks. But the European honeybee is not native. It's an exotic species. And the honeybee is often considered synonymous with pollination, except they're really not as efficient pollinators as our native bees are. Our native bees are, we'll see, our native bees are amazing. Some other reasons why I want to make the distinction between the European honeybee as an exotic species and our native bees is that the honeybee is aggressive. And so a lot of times, like some of my kids, one of my kids at least, anytime something buzzes, he's been stung before. And so he's like, oh, you know, but I'm like, hey, these native bees don't do that. You know, these native bees, we'll get into that. But so anyway, the native bees just really aren't known for stinging. And the European honeybee also competes with our natives. And so our natives are really in need of conservation. So now I want to get to those native bees. As we have all of these factors kind of acting upon our native species, with the changes in vegetation, the changes in all the structure, and then adding in the exotic pressure from the honeybees, we start to see in urban areas, especially, a loss of the diversity of our native bees. Now, what I just shown you on the slide right now is just a snippet. We have over 800 species of native bees in Texas, and they are incredibly beautiful. They're just gorgeous, and they really are in true need of conservation. You hear a lot about the honeybee needing conservation. There's no contest. Our native bees need conservation. The honeybee is the most prolific bee on the face of the planet. When you look at research across the world, the honeybee is the most prolific species of bee in the world. All of our native bees are in need of protection or conservation in a much greater sense. Plus, they're also just a lot more beneficial to have around. I said they're much better pollinators. One native bee can do the work of 300 honeybees. Now, some people may say, come on, John, that's just, you're full of it. But here's the reason why. If you look at the structure of the honeybee on the left, and you see that it has the corbicula, the little pollen bag, sac, so to speak, on the back of its leg. What it does is it kind of surgically goes in, grabs some pollen, mixes it with saliva, and sticks it in the little pollen basket there, the corbicula, and then flies off. The native bees on the right have what's called scopa, or these hairs all over the underside of their body. And that difference in structure means that they are just astronomically better at pollinating, because pollen is all over our native bees. And it's not just the structure. Our native bees visit more flowers per minute than do honeybees, and our native bees have a different landing behavior. They come in and belly flop onto a flower, and they just roll around on the flower, and they're just all up in that flower. I'm going to show you a video, if the video works, of a little small metallic bee doing this. It's just really interesting to watch. And also, our native bees have a greater weather tolerance, which means that they're out when it's colder and rainier than the honeybee, and they're out when it's hotter and drier than the honeybee. So there's a much longer and much more varied window for our native bees to do their important pollination work. So that's why they can do the work of 300 honeybees, just one of them, because they're just better. But here's the interesting thing. I call them personal pollinators. And what that means to me, the scientific term is they're central place foragers. What it means is that they nest and feed in a very small area. So many of them are less than about 300 yards. And so many of our native bees don't travel more than about 2 or 3 football fields, okay? Some only 15 yards. So for some of our super, super small native bees, your backyard might be the entire world for that bee. It's really amazing. That's why they are your personal pollinators. Now, I want to put this kind of to scale. So there is a educational honeybee hive at the Austin Nature and Science Center in Zilker Park, or in the Zilker area of Austin. So if you look at just the potential distance that the honeybees from that educational hive can travel to gather resources, it's that dotted circle. It's out to about 8 or 9 miles, and that covers essentially all of Austin. That one beehive has the potential to send foragers out over almost the entire city limits of Austin. If you look at the average foraging distance, it's smaller than that. It's about 6 kilometers or 3 3/4 of a mile, but still covers most of downtown, goes down into Sunset Valley, kind of out into some of the canyon lands. Still a significant impact or a significant ability to gather resources far and wide. Now, let's compare that to the average native bee foraging potential. Most fly less than that 300 meters, or about 0.18 of a mile. And so you can see that's the average foraging potential for native bees. What the Nature and Science Center does on their property really matters for our native bees. And what you do on your landscape really matters. That's why I call them personal pollinators, because they're central place foragers. And we've talked about, they're much safer. 90% of them are solitary. They have no hive to defend. That's the other thing to keep in mind is our native solitary bees, the vast majority of them, they're solitary. Like I said, some of them are social, like bumblebees, they're social, but most of our bees, our native bees, are solitary. And that means that the female does all the work. She doesn't have there's not a queen with workers to go out and gather food while the queen lays the eggs. She has to go out, gather the food, come in, lay the egg, take the thing, partition for the thing, seal the container, blah, 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 and go back out and do it all over again. And she's busy, busy, busy from sun up to sundown. She does it all. And so she has no hive to defend. So she doesn't sting. They're reluctant to sting at all, and many of them can't sting. And then even the cool thing is the venom composition has been shown to have a completely different chemical makeup than the honeybee. And so the risk of anaphylactic shock is lower. So just all around, our native bees are knocking it out of the park. So we really should be concerned about all the things that are happening to our really important invertebrates and our really important pollinators on our landscape. And if we wrap that all up into a summary, you can see as we urbanize, the habitat diversity decreases. Anthropogenic resources, which simply means man-made or man-sourced, like watering our yards and putting out trash, things like that. Those resources increase. Exotic competition increases. Specialists decrease. And so therefore, generally, what's left behind, generalists, thrive to nuisance levels. You can see on that slide, this is an example of a bird species that is a specialist that does well in urban environments and thrives to nuisance proportions. If we were in person, I would ask you to name that bird, but I'll tell you it's the grackle. And so, you can see, just think of grackles as kind of the response to much of our typical urbanization. So all that's the bad news. From here on out, it's good news because we can do something about this. First thing that we can do, I work in the preserves, and so, I'm going to put in a plug, support your parks, your preserves, your green belts. And it doesn't mean just the city of Austin. It means support state parks, national parks, these big areas where we have habitats that we're trying to manage in a native way. Those can serve as source populations for species that have been perhaps lost elsewhere. So support large-scale habitat. That's one of the first things you can do. But if you want to say, well, what can I do right now in the land that I own or the land that I manage? And I'm going to tell you, create habitat. Just start there. It's the old adage from the baseball movie, if you build it, they will come. And there are some great resources out there. I know there's some great resources that are going to be emailed to you after this. This team that's put this together has been phenomenal. There are some landscaping resources out there. These are my favorites: Native Texas Plants, There's Bringing Nature Home and Texas Wildscapes. Those are great books that are my favorites. I have them on the shelf and I use them all the time. But really what you're looking at doing is just simply trying to create or recreate components of habitat in your backyard, your side yard, your front yard, wherever you want to end up putting it. And it just simply means trying to provide food, water, shelter, all in an appropriately arranged space for whatever species or whatever groups of species you're trying to target. And how you do that is all depending upon the size of your property and your financial investments, et cetera. But it all starts with native plants. If there were one message that you heard today that's going to be the most valuable thing, it's going to be plant native plants, plant native plants, plant native plants. And the subtitle under that is don't plant exotic plants, don't plant exotic plants. It's really that important because that's just the fundamental basis. So this is a landscape that I did at a house I had before the one I'm in now. And so this is, I'm going to tell you kind of what all this is, but very quickly, I want to tell you that design is really for the human eye. Wildlife don't care about how it looks to humans much as we do. But here are some design tips, very quick ones. Just for the human eye to look at something, habitat like that you put in and think it's attractive. Typically, we put shorter things in the front, taller things in the back, that kind of thing. That's just a very simple design tip. Use masses of odd numbers. So a lot of times you'll see people that just line things up straight. Now you can see, I'm going to show you right here. There is a little line of plants here, but that's because I just had this very thin area. But still, a mass of the Blackfoot daisies here, a mass of wine cups, a mass of mealy blue sage. So, do these masses of odd numbers that tends to look more natural and more aesthetically pleasing. Again, very quick design tips. And most of the time when I show this slide, people want to know, what are those species? You can take a picture of this right now. I'll leave it up for just a few seconds, but we'll go through a lot of these plants in the beginning or later on in the presentation, but I'll show you right now. This Blackfoot daisy, this tall spire here, the blue thing is mealy blue sage. These little purple flowers are wine cups. This is a white variety of autumn sage, Salvia gregii. This is Engelmann daisy back here in the back. Under this oak tree I planted, this is inland sea oats, and you see a little bit of red Salvia gregii or autumn sage here. And we're going to go through all of these later on as we go through kind of the plant section, but I wanted to leave this up here just in case people wanted to shoot a picture of it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through just kind of groups of plants and talk about some of my favorites because of their wildlife values. This is in no means an exhaustive list, but I'm just going to go through some things. And some of them, like this first slide, I'm going to group them into just a group. I'm not going to go over individual oaks, but I'm going to tell you Quercus, the genus Quercus, the oaks, are probably, of all the big trees, probably the most valuable wildlife trees in North America. I'm going to say that. I might be wrong. They're very valuable. They feed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species. But if you look on the list on the left of the slide there, those are some species that we have that grow natural, native in Travis County. So any of those would be ones that you could choose from. Just kind of pick the site for each one of those. But I lumped them all together because they all kind of have, many of the similar qualities in that they produce that mass, they produce acorns. And so acorns are eaten by all kinds of wildlife, wood ducks, bobcats, turkeys, jays, nuthatches, brown thrashers. You could go on and on. The foliage is eaten by white-tailed deer, javelina, etc. But when you see LHP, I'm going to show you right here on the slide. When you see LHP, that means larval host plant for many species, larval host plant. But then you'll see for many species of lepidopterans. Lepidopterans are butterflies and moths. So when you see LHP, lepidopterans, that means larval host plant for moths or butterflies. That means the caterpillars will eat the vegetation. And when you look, I just have a few, I have many listed up there, but when you look nationwide at how many species feed, how many lepidopterans feed on oaks, literally hundreds of species. So tremendously wonderful selection. If you're gonna if you're gonna plant a tree, try to make it an oak. They're just so good. They are slow growing, some of them, for what it's worth. Continuing into trees, elms are also good. This is Ulmus, the genus Ulmus. We have 3 of them that are in this area: cedar elm, American elm, slippery elm. Same kind of thing. You know, they do provide some nectar in the spring, and they do provide a product in the fall that other, you know, songbirds and squirrels eat. Again, foliage is eaten by white-tailed deer, but it's the larval host plant, the vegetation for many lepidopterans, that really makes them valuable and makes this list. And I know cedar elm is often, I guess people often talk kind of bad about cedar elms, consider them a trash tree. I think they're awesome. I think about them from the perspective of wildlife food, and I think they're great. Excuse me. Speaking of another trash tree, according to a lot of people, hackberries, they feed a lot of wildlife. So they produce a fruit as well. But again, larval host plant for lots of different species in this area. And so that vegetation is constantly providing that 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars that birds need to raise a clutch of eggs. So great tree, even though often not given a lot of respect. Black walnut, we have Juglans nigra. In many cases in the east and northeast, we have a lot more walnuts than we do here, but we do have a walnut. It's the black walnut, and it's, again, larval host plant for many lepidopterans. And of course, a lot of stuff eat the walnuts that come off of the trees themselves. And you can see, you know, when those food products are available. I didn't explain that. When you see the boxes or the table there, the area that's colored red is what time of year that particular food source becomes most available. So you see on this slide, the nectar is most available in early spring. The fruit or the mast is most available in the fall, but the vegetation is summer, spring, and fall. Just to explain how that works. Now let's move into some of the, not the big shade canopy trees, but some of the more smaller ornamental trees. One of my all-time favorites, Mexican plum. It's beautiful, but it feeds all kinds of birds and mammals. So it produces a plum, and in the fall, and when that plum hits the ground, you better, if you haven't already harvested it for yourself, you better watch, because as soon as it hits the ground, stuff is eating it like crazy. If they're not eating it on the tree. So it feeds all kinds of birds and mammals. And then what I really love about this is very early in like February, just when you're really ready for winter to be over, this Mexican plum pops and it starts this beautiful, sweet blooming. And so it's a very good early nectar source for a lot of these early spring season bees and butterflies. And then again, larval host plant for lepidopterans as well. Another one of my favorites is the Texas redbud. In fact, I like to plant these two together. I like to plant a Mexican plum and then put a redbud in front of it, so that when I'm viewing it, I see the redbud in front and the Mexican plum in the back, because the red popping but with a white background, to me, is just gorgeous. Again, early nectar source in the spring. You see that? They will bloom shortly after Mexican plums, and sometimes they will overlap. Great early nectar source. In fact, if you see there on the left part of the screen, the currant mason bee, that is a native bee, a bright blue native bee that's found in this area. We have 2 mason bees that are found fairly commonly, but this currant mason bee is one of them. And they're most active in March. When you look at kind of their seasonal activity, they're kind of out in March, and then they're not really around a lot outside of March. And it really coincides with redbuds. And so if you want to see these bright blue bees, some of you may still have redbud blooms. And if so, go out and look, see if you get these mason bees on your redbuds. Mine have stopped. My redbud blooms stopped really kind of hosting these bees about 2 days ago. So they're no longer out there. The seeds that you see kind of in the middle, bottom part of the slide there, they're eaten by birds and other things. So this is a great tree to put in the ground for wildlife. Now, moving down into the shrubs, we get American beautyberry. The reason I love American beautyberry is not just because it's larval host plant for the sphinx moth, but those berries, it's appropriately named. They're beautiful. They feed all kinds of things. It's just a great wildlife plant. And I suggest it. Another one of they sound like they're all my favorites because I just love all these plants. Turk's cap. It feeds various songbirds. I don't have a picture on here. I should do that. I should put a picture of the little fruit. It looks like a tiny miniature apple. I'm told it's edible. I've never eaten it. I'm told it's not good. So, but anyway, nevertheless, it does produce lots of nectar, and it produces a fruit in the fall, and all of those things feed wildlife throughout that year. And then it is the larval host plant for some of our lepidopterans. Autumn sage is the only one that I don't really love for its larval host plant role. I love it because it just blooms all the time. I mean, in some years, I'll have it blooming in December, January. Other years, not so much. But man, you talk about just a solid, always available source of nectar. It's there. And it also really attracts hummingbirds. The Turk's cap and this Salvia greggii, some of the vines I'm going to talk about, they attract hummingbirds, and we kind of love hummingbirds in our yard too. Coralberry is another smallish kind of shrubby. This plant can get to 6 feet. Normally it doesn't. Mine stays in the 2.5 to 3 foot range. And I love this one because of its berries. That's its main feature. It is an early nectar source, but the nectar, at least from a viewing perspective, is not real showy, but it does get a lot of invertebrates that are nectaring on those early flowers. And then of course the vegetation is a larval host plant for a very cool invertebrate, the snowberry clearwing. If you look there in that picture, it looks like a or some people may call it a hummingbird moth, but it looks like a hummingbird, and you'll think it might be a tiny hummingbird, and then you get a picture of it and you say, oh, wait a minute, that's a moth. But it's the snowberry clearwing, and so that's the larval host plant for that. So I have these in my yard. I have coralberry in my yard, so that makes sense. So vines, I love myself a couple of these vines. That was not good English. So coral honeysuckle, one of my favorites, very well behaved. I love it, love it, love it. Hummingbirds love it. It's just beautiful. My family, my kids love it. My wife loves it. It's the larval host plant for spring azure butterfly. I have this stuff planted all around my yard. And it also tries to bloom all the time. Depends upon, the summer and how cold the winter is. I'm sorry. And so you just get that really nice nectar source, throughout the year. And then you do get a berry that it's produces, kind of throughout some parts of the year at least. So great plant to have in your landscape. Passion flower. I've got a word of caution. I have a couple of species of passion flower in my yard. So there's Passiflora incarnata or incarnata. There's also Passiflora lutea, and there's Passiflora foetida. They're all passion flowers. They're all great. They all have, in my opinion, they're all great. They have the larval host plant where they're feeding a lot of invertebrates in my yard, and I just love the flower itself. I'm going to warn you. When I first got, many years ago, when I first got into native plants and landscaping, I went to the nursery and I got what I was told was a native passion flower, but it had 5 lobes. Later learned that's the Asian passion flower, and it is a beast. It immediately started taking over. And so I fought that for 3 years. I, first of all, ripped all the plant out that I could when I realized what I had. And then I started ripping up all the little suckers that kept coming up. And it took me several years of just intense battle with that plant to finally get it removed. And so that's my word of warning to you. Make sure you get 3-lobed. So you get the 3 lobes. That's our natives typically have that. But just make sure you're going by, go to a nursery that really knows their stuff, that they know what species you're getting. And make sure again that you're getting one of those native species. Now, these plants, you put them in the ground and they're going to get eaten up. And that's the purpose. So a lot of times when I talk to people about passion flower, they say, oh, I love passion flower, but the caterpillars just eat it all up. And I'm like, they get so upset. And I'm like, but that's why I plant it. I plant it so that it gets eaten. It's a plant that's not being eaten by something's not doing its job in my landscape, unless it's, cucumbers or something like that I want to eat. But anyway, nevertheless, passion flower, really, really great plant, provided you don't get one of the exotic species. Let's move into grasses. Canada wild rye, various songbirds and mammals like the seeds and the foliage. White-tailed deer, of course, eat it, but it is the larval host plant. Many people don't realize grasses are larval host plants for many of our lepidopterans. It's the larval host plant for the Zebulon skipper. Little blue stem, another great grass I have in my landscape. Seeds, various songbirds and mammals, they eat seeds, they eat the foliage, and these are the larval host plant for a couple of skippers that we have in this area. Inland sea oats, again, birds and mammals eat those seeds like crazy. Foliage is eaten by a lot of different things. Larval host plant for a couple of skippers, again, that are found in this area. But in addition to that, I just love, this is one of the early seed setters in my landscape. They set seed pretty early in the summer, and it has like this nodding little seed head that does this in the wind. And I think visually it's just very attractive. So not only is it doing work for me in the landscape, it's pleasing me with that nodding seed head. When we move into forbs, we get into, of course, milkweeds. People always know, or people I think now know, the value of milkweeds for various butterflies. We've got several species here in Central Texas that are native. And that's the key. If there's one thing you hear me say about milkweeds, it's this: please plant native, not the tropical milkweed. Tropical milkweed is found in many nurseries. Don't plant that. Please, please, please don't plant that. It causes lots of problems. And those problems are for monarchs, at least. It causes lots of problems with monarchs, and it's very complicated. Some of the research says that it is actually making our monarchs not do the migratory pattern that they want to do. Not every monarch, not every native monarch in its native land does that pattern from Canada down to Mexico. I don't know if y'all know that. It's just this population in United States that kind of does that, right? There are populations elsewhere that are kind of there year round and they don't go down to Mexico. But this migratory pattern, I have to say, is one of the most amazing things in the insect world, period. How the monarchs leave Mexico and they breed and multiple generations move their way north. And then the super generation is born in the fall. And that super generation somehow knows not to just make its way back down, but I got to get moving. And they don't take multiple generations to get back down to Mexico. They just fly. And they do stopovers, don't get me wrong, but they're on a mission to try to get down to Mexico. And they're the only generation that does that. And then several generations later, they don't do that. I don't know how this happens. I've never read a paper that says how it happens. It's amazing. These milkweeds are very important in Texas because as the population from the winter down in Mexico moves into the United States, it moves up through Texas. Vast majorities move up through Texas. And these milkweeds are the very first kind of like, this is our first gas station where they're going to stop. They're going to be feeding, they're going to be mating, they're going to be laying eggs, and they're going to be doing all the things they're going to be doing. They're going to be moving on. And so our milkweed populations being strong really sets them up well every year. Okay, so that's really important. The difficulty here is you find the tropical milkweed in a lot of nurseries, and it's not good for the monarch. You don't find a lot of the milkweeds in many of our native nurseries. And so you have to kind of get involved in Native Plant Society or some other, maybe organic garden clubs or some other niche markets where people are really doing this. I happen to know some suppliers that really grow milkweeds. And so maybe we can talk about that later. But really try to get a hold of these natives and put those in your landscape, because don't plant exotics, please. Oh, I don't think I have said, you know, the monarch depends on these, the queens depend on these. So, you know, they do just wonderful, wonderful stuff for our wildlife. Ingleman's daisy. This plant is very high in protein. So there are a lot of species, a lot of mammals will eat it. Livestock will eat it like crazy, deer, rabbits, etc. Birds will eat that parts of that plant as well. Bees love it. Various butterflies love it. And so that's why, you know, I put this in my landscape as well. And then, so these are the ones that I showed you in the picture, the Blackfoot daisy. Some of the ones have gone over last. Blackfoot daisy, I have a lot in my landscape. It's the seeds are fed on by birds, but really I put it because it really is a good source of nectar and pollen for bees. And again, lots of different species of butterflies. You can go out there and see all kinds of things on Blackfoot daisy at any particular time. This plant, wine cup, is recognized by the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. So if you're talking about invertebrates and really the science behind how we should be treating invertebrates, the Xerces Society really is where you should go. They're great information. They really focus on invertebrates, and they have said wine cup is designated as a plant of special value to native bees. So I have it in my landscape. I also love it as a photography platform. It produces lots of nectar, again, larval host plant for species. But I love to camp out near wine cups and take pictures of bees coming in. These are a couple of ones. You can see those pictures are both, you know, wine cup. The one on the right is much zoomed in. You can see on the left is one of our bigger metallic sweat bees, and the one on the right is a tiny, tiny, tiny metallic sweat bee. You would almost think it's a gnat, and if you're not really looking for it, you won't even pay attention to it. You wouldn't probably. I never did. I never recognized it as a bee until I realized that's what it was, and now I look for these. Anytime you see a little gnat-like thing flying around a wine cup, if you can really look closely, it's probably one of these really small metallic sweat bees. Greg's Mistflower. I didn't use this one for a long time, but I have it in my landscape now, and oh my gosh, where have you been in my whole life? Man, it just feeds like crazy. And I don't know if many of you are old enough to know the old Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Birds, right? The scenes where birds are just everywhere. People are like, oh, if you go in my backyard in the fall, man, that's what it's like. You walk up to my Greg's Mistflower and you're just surrounded by by butterflies. My kids love it. They just want to go out there and just see all the butterflies. It's visually impressive. And so, man, I love that plant. It's a larval host plant for one of our metal monarchs. Sunflowers. Here's a word of warning, along with a little bit of love for these plants. I love, love, love sunflowers. We have two native to this area that are really common. First of all is the common one. The next one is Maximilian. Common sunflower blooms in the summer. Maximilian blooms in the fall. Plant these where you're okay with them kind of taking over. Or commit yourself that you're going to have to enforce a boundary on these, especially Maximilian, because once that thing seeds out and sends this, I think they're stolons, sends those out, it just starts to pop up. So if you have a place where you're okay with that, man, these are great. They become just their own little city of all kinds of insects around them all the time. And I just love them, love them, love them. But you have to put them in a place where you're okay with them really kind of taking over and owning the place. But anyway, all kinds of things eat them. The seeds are eaten by birds. They're larval host plant for lepidopterans. They're just great, great plants. Mealy blue sage. I plant mealy blue sage in all my landscapes. A lot of nectar for a long time. It's just a staple again. Occasionally you'll see hummingbirds feeding on this, but I just really like it because it's just a great nectar source that's reliable. And now here's the section where maybe it gets a little stepping on people's toes. And I'm going to tell you, I've stepped on my own toes, even putting this together, because I have seen in the last 2 years, me as a biologist, I've been a biologist for years, and I've changed how I manage my yard in the last 2 years because of things that I've learned. These weeds that I have, in many cases in my yard, been battling forever, you know, and I never knew, because I didn't really get into bees until about really get into them about 2 years ago, but I started dabbling about 5 or 6 years, something like that. These weeds, so-called weeds, really feed a lot of bees. They're early nectar sources and early pollen sources. So you see the small flower desert chicory, the Texas dandelion as it's called, man, you'll just see a lot of bees on it early in the spring. And most of the time people kind of wage war against this because it's seen as a weedy species. And I've gone to where I don't mow them down. I leave them, I mow around them. There's also an aster. I'm not sure specifically which one, probably y'all can tell me, but there is a weedy looking aster that has like a weedy appearance. It can get to be kind of, you know, shrubby, moundy, like, and the flower is like tiny flower. And I've been battling that in my yard because I just don't like the way it looks. Until I started just looking at what comes to these flowers. And then I have photographed all of these native bees on this aster that I don't like. And so now I leave it. There you go. I may not like it, but I know the bees love it. So I want to watch bees. And there's another one in the bottom left-hand corner, crow poison. It's a tiny little weedy thing, very early bloomer. And it attracts a lot of those really small metallic green bees. They're probably, I would say, 4 millimeters in length, something like that. And then I also have the upright coneflower or the Mexican hat. I'm not saying most people consider this a weed, although as far as wildflowers are concerned, there are many consider it to be kind of a weedy looking wildflower. So I put it up there. I don't mow these down either, but some consider them weedy. And I see a ton of native furrow bees on Mexican hat or upright coneflower. So it's just another one of those that we should just leave around. Now, this is a video, and if it works, you're going to see this is crow poison. I want to show you before I start the video. This is the tip of my finger. This is the tip of my thumb, and the bee is in there. So I reached down and was holding this flower while I was filming this, and the bee never cared. But this flower is a tiny little flower with a little bitty bee in there. And I just want to show you how this native bee, the behavior, getting in there and wallowing around while she's doing her job. I want to play this for you. And then I think shortly after that, we're going to go maybe go to a break, but let's see if this will play. You can see she's kind of in there, and then she's going to flip around to her side here in a minute. Just really get in there. Look at that. She's really just kind of wallowing around in there. So you can see that's why they are much greater pollinators than the honeybee. And she's doing all that with me holding the flower. So just cool, going about her business. And so there you go. All right, Daphne.
Wow, John, what an amazing video. I love that so much. And you're right that she was there, you were holding that flower. You're an amazing bee whisperer, I would say. So great. Well, first, I also want to thank you for admitting that there are plants in your yard that you don't like the looks of, but you leave them for the bees. What an inspirational admission. So thank you for saying that. Hopefully that inspires a few others of us to do the same. Okay, let's ask some questions. First, one that just came to my mind as we were talking, you know, we're listing these wonderful native species that we can plant in our yard. We're listing specific plants, but can we go out a little broader and have a look at, especially when we're talking about bees, flower color and flower shape? Are there any specific colors or shapes that are more attractive to bees, or that they're attracted to more than other colors or shapes?
So when you look at native bees, the thing that you have to kind of come at that question understanding is this. Our native bees have developed over thousands, some say millions, it's billions perhaps of years, certainly within like the tall grass prairie and the Edwards Plateau ecosystem of Travis County. Maybe not billions of years, but the point is these systems have kind of developed together. And so what we see is many species or groups of bees have this special relationship with another group of plants. Some of them are so specialists, so much of specialists, that species of bee will only land on another species of flower, and they are tied together. And if you lose one, you lose the other one. And you can't restore them both unless you can't restore them unless you restore both. So what's really important is planting a diversity of native plants out there, because there are bees that have developed kind of along with that. So I'll give you an example. I mean, typically what they say, I'll just tell you kind of what the normal walking around information you hear are those flowers that open up like this and are flat, right? So that bees can land on them, butterflies can land on them. That those, they say, are better for bees and for butterflies because of that structure. And I understand that. And I don't say that's not true. But I don't want to have our audience here think that well, then that means that long tubular flowers aren't good for bees. They are. I have crossvine in my yard, and bees will land, those little metallic sweat bees, they'll land on there, they'll crawl in there. So it just really, for bees especially, there are some plants that have specific structures that those bees are co-adapted to really fit together. And so a lot of times when the bee will fly up to a flower, the flower itself is structured such that when the bee comes up to feed on it, the pollination happens right here. So sometimes it's on the belly, sometimes it's on the top of the head. And those relationships really, in my opinion, as a biologist, kind of make it hard to generalize plants with this structure are better for bees, and plants with this structure aren't, or plants with this color, etc. Now, that being said, typically, stuff that is white, stuff that blooms at night, that's going to be attracting moths, right? Stuff that's the bright reds and all those other colors, that typically attracts kind of other groups of species. So there is some value to, kind of having that conversation, but it's not as simple as, well, you really need to plant all, plants that have this place where the bee can land on it, because it really is such a dance between the pollinators and the flowers themselves, so that all of our natives, diversity of native plants really leads to a better diversity of pollinators.
Well, that leads right into my next thought that we need to talk through, and that is that it's important not only to think about specific species and colors and shapes of flowers to plant in our yard and focusing on natives, but what about having something that flowers, different plants that flower in different seasons of the year?
Absolutely.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So that's why I put up there are some plants that I plant because they provide nectar in times when others don't. So what you want to try to do, and you have limited space. I mean, you don't have 15,000 acres, maybe you do, but in your yard, what we're talking about is you have limited space. And so what you want to do is you want to really think about, certainly when you put your plan together, if that's what you're doing, or maybe if you look at your landscape now and you're just examining, hey, in July, nothing's blooming, then go find something that blooms in July. Find 5 things that bloom in July. And in my opinion, I would rather have 3 specimens of 5 different species than have 15 specimens of one species, because that way you're going to be providing that diversity. But definitely you want to have things that are providing nectar early in the spring, in the middle of the hot summer, late in the fall, typically in that December, January. Most of our stuff that's looking for nectar is in its hibernation, but not all. And you'll even see things, that's why stuff that blooms year round, like the autumn sage and coral honeysuckle and stuff like that. Very, very important to provide food sources throughout the year.
Yeah. And then you also mentioned, especially about the passion flower and getting the wrong one versus the right one. And I could tell you numerous stories of times when I've gotten a call at the office of someone asking about a plant, talking to me in common name terms. And we'll have a whole conversation about this plant, and then I'll hang up, and as you do, you go away. The next day you dream about it, or you think about it in the shower and you think, oh my gosh, we were not talking about the same plant. Some different plants have the same common name often. So
Yes.
it's very important when you're shopping in the nursery to, if you can at all possible, look for the scientific name down to the species and the variety, or even potentially cultivar on those plants if you're looking for them, to make sure you get what you're really looking for in your yard.
I agree. And I even go so far. I mean, I have nurseries that I frequent, and and I have gone to the buyer before. If I'm asking the people that are on the floor, what species is this? And they can't tell me, I go to the buyer, and normally the buyer will be able to tell me. And I have found nurseries that really specialize in natives, which I will say as a general rule, that's where I go. I go to places that specialize in natives. It's the mom and pops. Typically is where I find a better experience from a native plant enthusiast than, some of the large scale box stores. But so I'll ask the buyer, and the buyer will say, oh, no, we get that from this person. And, and sometimes they've even sent me to the grower. And so sometimes I'll do that. Not everybody should have to do that, but good point. Make sure you're getting the right species.
And then another point that you made about milkweed and the importance of using those native species versus the tropical, and the challenge that we all have in finding those species. Just there aren't people hiking around at what we would call a plantsman back in the day when I got my degrees, walking around looking for plants, finding cool things, knowing the difference, getting those seeds, and then getting those into the nurseries. And then often our native species to plant from seed in a nursery setting, it's very challenging to get them to grow from seed and then to get them out into the trade. So there are lots of reasons why those species are not as widely available as we would all like for them to be. So just to point out that, yeah, that's something that we all go through. We were asked a question about where can we find those native sources? Please give us the native milkweed. Please give us sources. We really don't have any magic source to share. Just talk around, and as you mentioned, Native Plant Society friends who might have some in their yard and be having some luck to get it all propagated and have those pass along plant situations. How important those are for some of these species that we talk about, because they just are not available in the large commercial trade, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and I would say there's in addition to what you said, there's a reason, like a real monetary reason. So if you're trying to make money on a product, you want to sell that product as far and wide to as large a market as possible. And by definition, some of our native plants are niche. So you're like, why would somebody who really wants to sell to a large market create a product, grow a product that's got a niche market at best? And so there's a financial reason for that, for why some of these are hard to find. So the workaround for me has been, and I suggest this for others, if you're in Austin, great, because there's a great network of people here that are really into native plants. If you're not, look around for Native Plant Society, and then for plant swaps and for native plant sales. They often happen. They may not be in an actual nursery, but they might be at a local rec center or something like that, where the Native Plant Society gets together and they do plant swaps and plant sales to raise money. And a lot of those people have figured out how to grow those ones that you don't find in the nursery. But here's the key: go to those events and make friends, because then you'll start really figuring out who grows what. And I can tell you through doing that, I probably can't mention a person, but I know a person that grows a bunch of milkweeds, and I wouldn't have known that had I not gone to these. So that's how you get that information: is you go to those events and you look around. So go online, search for native plant swap around me or near me. Go to one, start making friends, start asking questions. I want Zizotes milkweed. Where do I find that? Who grows that? And they'll go, oh, that's this person, right? That's how I find stuff.
And I think now, especially post-pandemic, it's really good to encourage people. We are having trouble getting our own crew of volunteers, our own cohort of people that we are accustomed to getting together with in person together. And so you're right, just go to those meetings, get to make some new friends. I think we could all use a good dose of that now that we've, our lives have been upended for 4 years. It's seeming like it's never going to end, huh?
Yeah.
Well, just one more discussion point I want to have with you. We have a couple more questions, but we'll do them at the end. You talked about some of those tree species that are denigrated, and I'll just throw hackberry out there as an example. We do get a lot of questions. The history of those trees, a lot of those denigrated species are that Texas, the rancher is king in a lot of areas of Texas, and ranchers come in and clear that property for their cattle to graze. And so they have a very hated relationship with some of those species like mesquite and hackberry. And then from a homeowner's perspective, hackberries, out in the native area, birds eat those seeds. That's why we want to have those plants. And then inevitably, the bird will plant that seed very kindly for you in your yard, right on your fence line. And so there are some reasons why those trees are not admired in our community or not respected. But there's some very good reasons to plant them purposefully in areas where you want them rather than where they are planted by happenstance. But I'd love for you to just to kind of dive into that topic real quick before we hop back in.
Oh, I don't know that there's more I can dive in on. I mean, you got it right. To me, the definition of a weed is a plant where you don't want it. Well, I got plenty of those in my yard. There's some stuff I'm trying to control because it doesn't. I have a tree that keeps trying to grow right next to where my gate is, and so it's like it's sending, and I'm just like, well, I'm sorry, but you're going to go because I have a gate right here. So anyway, that's how I view it. Is we do make these decisions. I'm trying to make my decisions with other species at the table rather than just because I said so. Now if that plant's in a place where I can't have it, then yeah, I remove it. But if not, I kind of leave it. So
as I said to the coral snake that I scared out of my yard just 2 days ago, you don't have to die, but you can't live here. You got to go on somewhere else to the green belt behind my house and take up residence back there. You can't live in my yard and potentially bite me or my puppies. So
yeah.
All right, John,
everybody makes that choice.
I'll let you jump back in and we'll have some more questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, let's see. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to move into, so we've been this far and we've just been talking about basically food. Don't let that make you swoon. We may move through some of these others a little faster because food's so important, but water is equally important and often overlooked. In fact, if I were to say one of the things of these food water shelter space is often overlooked, it's water. People will plant plants and forget about water. Water can be provided in your landscape in any number of ways, and you decide what that is based upon safety, based upon how much you can put in, how much work you can put in, how much money you want to spend, how much time you want to spend fiddling with it. But if you'll notice, so you can have just an above ground tub. We're going to talk about pluses and minuses. You can have a giant pond in your yard, pluses and minuses. You can have just a little shallow dish or a shallow bowl. In this case, somebody hewn out a rock and they use that as their water feature. That's fine. Or you can go as far as having a recirculating stream in your yard if that's what you want. So all of these are options. They all have benefits. They all have their pros and cons, and we'll go through some of that. But again, I'm going to come back to a central point. If you're going to have a water feature and you're going to plant it with something, please use native plants only. The reason I say that is because many of our exotic species that are super aggressive are aquatic species. You look at hydrilla, you look at water hyacinth, some of those that just completely obliterate any of our aquatic habitats. They're exotic species. So plant natives only, please, for the sake of our preserves. That's my perspective. Not everybody's, but mine. Now, so I will tell you, on the right of your screen is a water feature in my backyard. So full transparency. On the left is a water feature in a friend of mine's backyard. Now you notice the one on the left, they're both small water features, but notice the one on the left has this nice beach area where birds, toads, lizards, turtles, whatever, can come right here and they can choose what depth they want to be, and they can just walk right back out. So great little ingress and egress. This person really thought this through and made a great little point there. Mine has a very hard edge. Mine's not plastic. It is at least a really durable, birds can grip it. But if you go to a big box store and you get some of these above ground pond liners, this part will be very, very slick. So what I've done is I've made it so that they can get access, not having to, hop up or whatever. They can climb up onto this rock wall, get here, and then I've created a little stair step down in so that birds and whatever else can get here. And this is maybe half an inch. That's maybe an inch deep. That's maybe 3 inches deep. And they can go as deep as they choose. And if they happen to fall in here, well, they're right next to a way that they can step right back out. What you don't want to do is create a drowning hazard in your water feature that you put in because you love wildlife. So make sure you think that through. Make sure you consider, can birds, can frogs, can lizards, if they end up falling in, can they get out? And some people may say, why would a frog need out? Actually, a frog can drown. A lot of people don't realize that. And if they get in, especially if it's a toad and they get in and they just cannot get out, they can't regulate their water concentration in their body. So you need to be able to make sure things can get in and out. So that's ingress and egress, something to think about, whatever water feature you choose. Again, this one's a water feature in my yard. We need to talk about clean water. And I want to say, I have a perspective, and it's not everybody's perspective, but I'm a biologist. So I tend to lean towards ecological systems being able to clean themselves. If you go into some retail stores, you might be told that you need, this kind of a filter, or this kind of chemical, this kind of that, this kind of this. I say do your research, come up with your approach, and then you make that decision. I don't use any chemicals in my my water. What I do is I watch out for chlorine. I don't actually get all the chlorine out of my water because I add so little, and chlorine vaporizes out of the water, out of moving water so quickly that I've found that I can top it off with chlorinated water and it doesn't affect my ecosystem. But I don't use any expensive filters. I use nature. This is a bog filter. And so what that means is this is a metal bucket. You go to a local store and get it. And this has a recirculating pump that's in the water right here. And there's a line that goes around here and comes up the backside, and it's hard to see. You can see right here, that's the flow coming off of this rock. So my water is moving. And then there's another line that comes out and goes under, goes up and into my bog filter. And this is full of lava rock, gravel, and the roots from this native star sedge, I think it is. I can't remember which one it is. And so the way I have mine set up is it goes in and it goes all the way to the bottom and it fills up. Now I know the outlet is at the bottom, so hang with me. Goes into the bottom and it fills up so that the water slowly rises up through all the root material, where the roots suck out all the nitrogen and all the nutrients. And then I have a little overflow that's right here. And that overflow carries under my rock, goes over to the side, goes down through PVC, and then is released out here. It's easier if you wanted to put your outlet up here at the top. I wanted to put my outlet at the bottom, but you could put it at the top and you don't have to do all the PVC stuff. You just want to release the water at the bottom so that it fills up and goes all the way up through that root zone before it spills back over into your pond. There are all kinds of websites. All you have to do is look online for a do-it-yourself bog filter, and it's easy. That's what I use. And it keeps my water nice and clean. You can see that's clear. That's clear water. So the bog filter is important. Aeration, I get aeration by those two movements of water. I have the one that's the waterfall that's just spitting water out, aerating, and then I have going through my bog filter and spitting water back in, and that adds some aeration as well. I think those are important things. But aside from that, you don't really need all these expensive things that you might think you need if you go somewhere. I will say, I do have a mechanical filter on my pump right under the water here. It's just a sponge thing that fits over the intake. You don't want to suck in any of your fish or your dragonfly larvae and grind them up in your pump. So that's not good for your pump, not good for them. So I have a mechanical filter that keeps that from happening. And I just remove that, rinse it out, clean it off, stick it right back on. I do that every couple of weeks in the summer. Outside of that, I can go a couple of months without it. So here's another shot. In addition to the movement and the plants that I have in here trying to take up, this is a fall obedient plant. I have it sitting in the water because it likes wet feet. So it's cleaning some nutrients for me. But what I have here is a barley bale that you can order online, just a small little, kind of look like a small loaf of bread. And you can put that in there. And I have this so that it's right at the edge where all my waterfall hits that and then disperses. I don't know how it works. I haven't been able to find anyone who tells me how it works, but chemically, as barley decomposes in the water, it needs to be right at the surface of the water so it gets some air and stuff. But as it starts to decompose, it releases a natural chemical that helps to control the algae that grow and create the green pea soup looking kind of water. But you can see how clear the water is there. I have algae growing here. That's okay. But the water itself is clear. So a little barley bale helps me keep that algae clean. Now, the other thing I want to address is mosquitoes, because people often ask, I don't want to put one of those in, how do you control mosquitoes? I use Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, dunks. They're little wafers that you can buy in a local nursery. And it has a bacterium in there. And when you put it in there, that dunk will kind of disintegrate and put bacteria in the water that go after mosquito larvae. So BT dunks work well. You can see in the background of this picture, I just noticed this. This is my mechanical filter, the little sponge that goes over the edge of my intake for my pump. I also have mosquito fish, Gambusia affinis. Big ones are about 2 inches long, smaller ones are smaller than that. I put them in there. They just do their thing. They eat mosquito larvae, live on their own, they're native. What I have found is you can't get these at most of your big box pet stores. So you have to go to the mom and pop. I'll just say you have to go to a mom and pop because we can't recommend a particular business, but find a mom and pop fish shop that's not one of the big box stores, and you might be able to find these. I know you can find them in Austin because I got mine. Once you put them in, you pretty much just kind of leave them alone, even through the winter. My pond froze. I don't know if it froze solid or not, but the top of it was totally frozen. And my Gambusia are doing fine. So we're moving out of water now into shelter. Oh, let me back up a little bit. I do want to say this one thing. I'm going to back up to right here. In July and August, when everything is stressed, my kids love to go to the back door of our house and look. And there was a line of doves and other birds waiting to step down into the water and come back out and fly away. And they would line up all down the edge of my rock and up on my fence and just all the way down. And you would watch them. That one would go in, get his drink, fly away. The whole line would move. Get the drink, fly away. The whole line would move. It was awesome. My kids loved it. So certainly in that July, August, September, water is super critical. Shelter. I think I've been trying to drive home the point that native habitat does the work for you. That if you're putting in the habitat, animals are going to get what they need. They're going to get the food, the water, the shelter, etc. So we don't need to do a whole lot, from a man-made perspective that really helps the animals if you're putting the habitat in. So that's key. If you want to assist them with shelter, we'll talk about that. But the main thing is the plants. This is a great example. So you remember the Mexican hat that I talked about earlier? I'm 57, and in the last year, I learned that furrow bees will sleep underneath Mexican hats. I'm wondering how I lived to be so long, and how I lived to be out in nature all those years, and I didn't know that. But one day I just turned one over, 7 o'clock in the morning, looking around, turned one over, and lo and behold, there are 4 or 5 furrow bees sleeping under all the Mexican hats. I never knew that. And shortly thereafter, I just happened, because then I was like, well, what else have I not ever seen? I looked into the bushy blue stem, which was growing near a water feature behind my house. And you can open that stuff up, and there were furrow bees hiding in there too, resting, daytime shelter for them. So native plants really, really do, like I said, do the work for us to create shelter. But if you want to arrange native structures in a way that provides shelter, that's great. You can do wood piles. You can, if you have the ability to, in your yard, if a tree dies and you have the ability to leave it standing, man, leave it standing, because so many other things live in a dead tree that don't live in a live tree. If a live tree dies and you can't leave it standing, because maybe it's going to fall on your house or your neighbor's house, perhaps at some point in the future, well, cut it down and leave it on the ground to be a log in your yard somewhere. Find a place for that to be okay, because all kinds of animals love to be in there. For example, I don't know if most people know this, but lightning bugs, fireflies, they need rotting, decaying wood to complete their life cycle. And so if you don't have that in your landscape, you're not providing for them. And I don't know if y'all love those animals, but I do. You can create dry stacked rock walls. All of my rock walls that I put in my landscape, I dry stack most of it. I may put a few key pieces cemented together, but the rest of it in between is dry stack for the purpose of providing places for animals. You can also create, bring in, or if you have something in your yard that dies, but it's a hollow log, leave it there, because the hollow log provides a great habitat for species. And in my yard, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, I've gone to cutting limb damage, and taking limb damage, cutting it into pieces that are at least longer than 6 inches, and then drilling holes in that are 6 inches deep, just a few different diameters, and then just throwing those out in my landscape, because our native bees like those holes. And it provides a way for me to increase their opportunity for having a nesting site without doing things that I think can be detrimental to them. Because in nature, they nest in, rotting logs that lie on the ground, trees that have died but have beetle holes in them. That's what they nest in. Or carpenter bees create their own holes, but many species will use holes secondarily. So that's something I'm doing in my landscape to try to, provide more habitat for them in a natural kind of way. But again, what I've recently learned from Xerces Society is I wasn't managing my landscape right. I had all the native plants for years, but I would go in and deadhead everything and clean it up right before the spring and do all the things that people do. And Xerces is saying, don't do that. They have this save the stems effort. And here's how they lay it out. In your first winter, after your plants have gone dormant, this happens to be purple coneflower head. And it says, leave those dead heads through the winter, because they provide a seed source, and there might actually be bees in those stems. It says that there may be some things overwintering there. And so then what you do is, in the spring, when you start this program, cut those dead heads off at varying heights from 8 to 24 inches. And here's the key, leave those dead heads on the ground. If there are bees or anything nesting inside those stems, they'll be able to complete their life cycle, come out and do their thing. So you haven't hurt them, unless, the statistically rare chance that you might actually cut through one of them, that's going to be bad. But the benefits are that you now create these hollow stem nesting sites, especially if you're using species that are hollow stemmed, like purple coneflower, like ragweed. I know people hate ragweed, but it's hollow stemmed. Sunflower, there are a lot of other hollow stems that can't go through right now. But so if you do this, then what happens is as the new growth grows up, it'll hide those old stems. That new growth provides the food, but the cut stems provide nesting sites. So in my yard, this is one of those, that's purple coneflower. And so that little metallic sweat bee is about probably 4 or 5 millimeters in length. And those bees can fit down in the holes of my cut purple coneflower. So you have the food and everything there, and now you have the nesting site that you just created with this hollow stem. And what will happen is, if you'll let me use my pointer, these bees will go into these stems, and at the bottom they'll place a pollen loaf, big ball of pollen, and they'll lay their egg on top. Then they'll seal it with mud or leaves, and they'll do the same thing again. They'll put pollen, an egg, seal it, pollen, egg, seal it, and they'll do that, up the stem. And that's how they'll overwinter, is in that stem. So now you're in winter number 2. So you're a year after you started this. Again, leave your dead heads through the winter, leave the previous cut stems because they may contain overwintering insects. And then spring number 2, again, do the same thing. Cut dead heads from the previous year at varying heights, leave the dead heads on the ground, leave the previous year's cut stems alone, because now what you see is you may have bees coming out of the old dead stems, feeding, and then going into your new cut stems, and the process continues. And you just leave the old stems because they eventually decay. And then finally, if you're doing all this stuff, in a natural way to create habitat, make sure that you're protecting these ways that these species overwinter. If you do have these these chambers that are sealed, make sure you're taking care of those. Keep your leaves in the fall, if at all possible. Keep them where they fall. Maybe you can't. So the fallback is rake them up and move them to a bed nearby, but leave them on site. I'm going to confess, up until again about 2 or 3 years ago, I had a mulcher that I would suck up my leaves and mulch them off of my front lawn, and then I would go put them in my landscape beds. And then I read I probably was mulching a bunch of overwintering pollinators, and so I don't do that anymore. Now I may, in the places where I have to have a clean area, I'll rake those leaves and I'll put them in a nearby bed. But if I can leave the leaves there, I leave them there because of the overwintering pupa and all the other things that might be in there waiting. And I so anxiously try to attract them, and I don't want to now kill them by processing my fall leaves. So here's the big question. I need to take a drink. Here's my question I want you to ponder. Are nest boxes okay or not okay? The answer is it depends. I have nest boxes on my property, but I know that I'm creating habitat with native plants. That's the main thing to do. That's the best way. Native plants are the best feeders because you never have to clean them or refill them. They do that themselves. Native plants are the best shelter because you never have to clean it out and all that kind of stuff. It kind of just does its own thing. Native plants are the best way to provide habitats. So then where is the role of the niche for nest boxes? I'm going to say this, and then you may not disagree, so hear me out. Nest boxes are for you. They may benefit a species, but they're really kind of for us. So I have nest boxes because I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so what I want to do is I want to put these nest boxes in places where I can take my 6-year-old. I can put her on my hip and I can lift up and I can say, see, look, that bird is doing these things. See, that plant that you planted over there that brought that caterpillar here, that bird's feeding these baby young, and then we close it and then we put her down again. That's why I have nest boxes. So are they good? Yeah. Are they necessary for wildlife? No. Most of the time, they're not. Now we could, if we had a Dr. Pepper and we were sitting around a coffee table, we could argue all day long about, are there some species right now that there's a conservation need in nest boxes? Yes, but for the most part, nest boxes are for us. Now, having said that, what about bee boxes, bee hotels, bee blocks? I have these too. But hopefully you've seen now, I'm doing everything I can to create habitat for them. So they don't need these nest boxes or these bee blocks. So why do I have them? I have them at the eye level of about a 6-year-old. Because I want my 6-year-old to be able to watch these bees doing their thing, going and getting pollen from the plants that we planted and coming here and raising their young and laying eggs. And I want her to be able to see that. I want my son to be able to see it. And so I put those nest boxes in a place where I can engage them because I want them to love nature as much as I do. And plus because I love to watch it. But if you're going to do this, there are some things to consider. Number one, it needs to be 6 inches deep at least, because what happens is I'm going to use this again on my screen. So if this isn't 6 inches and your little inserts are not 6 inches, let's say it's just 4. I used to put up 4x4s and I would drill like a 3 3/4 inch hole in there because I didn't realize at the time that I was doing something that could harm the population of my native bees. If this is not 6 inches or more, what happens is you skew the sex ratio of the offspring, because the first 4 inches, she puts males. I don't know how she does this, but that's what she does. And the last inches, she puts females. So if all she has is 4 inches in this hole, all you're going to get is males. So you make these holes much deeper so that she has the choice, so she can then create a good sex ratio for the next generation and the next. The other thing is, I've gone to using these removable little tubes in a protected area that have the hole diameter of 5/16 or 3/8. You can get these online. Anyway, you want to remove them after they're filled up, right? You'll know. So I let them go out for the whole season, and then when the season ends, like in the fall when it starts to get cold, you can take them in, or you can leave them out, but you can take them in. And then when it starts to get warm again, I put them back out. I have mine in a release box. I'm not going to go into that, but I have a release box specifically designated, so I put those in there. What you don't want to do is you don't want to leave just kind of holes in wood out for years and years. And you don't want to leave a concentration of these nesting sites out years after year after year, because, well, and I think my next slide is it. Okay. So with that in mind, I say don't do this, because most people, when they build something this involved, they kind of think I'm done and they walk away. So I say don't do that. If you're going to do this, you really got to commit, because you've got to replace that stuff every year, every 2 years at least. Because, well, let me get to the because in a minute. Also, a lot of people use bamboo, plastic, metal, or glass. That doesn't allow for the bees to have the right moisture level in the chamber. They like wood, and so, or they like the stemmy kind of stuff. So these cardboard straws kind of mimic that. And then also varying diameters. You get different species like different diameters, and so that really helps, again, the diversity. But here's the reason why I say don't do this, right? Don't create like a massive area where all these native bees are going to be reproducing without changing all of the stuff out. Because there are diseases and parasites that will find this, and it then becomes a buffet. And what you've now created is what we call an ecological sink. You've attracted all these animals, all these insects to this place because they think this is a great thing. But when they try to reproduce there, all their reproductive efforts getting stolen by either a disease, by parasites, or by predators. So that's why I say, if you're going to do this, really make sure that you clean all that stuff out, that you keep the disease and the parasites and the predators at bay as best as possible. I'm going to tell you a little story. This wasp, this is on one of my on one of my bee blocks. First time I saw it, I got excited because I was like, "Ooh, a new species of bee, and it's beautiful." So I took a picture, and I went in and looked it up, and it is an exotic cuckoo wasp. It's beautiful, but it goes into, once the native solitary bee goes in, lays her egg, this wasp goes in and lays its egg on there, and it parasitizes all the work that my native bee just did. So now I manage against this species. When I see them, they don't survive. That's a decision that I make. Maybe you would make a different decision, but I'm here to raise native bees. And so I'm going to try to do all I can to keep this thing from not happening. So if you're going to do bee hotels, do them for you, do them for your kids, but just make sure that you're aware that it requires a commitment to really continue to do something good year after year. And then the last thing about how to provide shelter is this concept of bare soil. If you're like me, you've heard for years, mulch all the bare soil, mulch the soil, mulch it, mulch it, mulch it, mulch it, mulch it. So that's what I did until I got really into what that's doing to our bees. 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. They need access to bare soil. And so now I specifically leave areas open, unmulched, so that my cavity nesting bees can have access to soil. If you look on the left, that is a mining bee. The holes behind it, I'm going to point them out. See right here, these little holes? This is on a cliff at the Austin Nature and Science Center. If you ever visit the Austin Nature and Science Center and you walk around the pond, there's a trail around the pond that's right next to the Austin Nature and Science Center, and you look to that that cliff, depends on which way you're walking, left or right, but there's a cliff, the opposite to the pond. You'll see this wall, and it is full of these miner digger bees. And I'm trying to remember the genus. I can't remember the genus. Anyway, they all come out in mass, and kind of like the osmia I was talking about earlier, or the mason bee, they're only out for a couple of weeks and then they're done. And so, the whole, their whole ability to exist is because of this feature. They have access to this big bare cliff of dirt. Maybe you don't have that in your yard, but you can leave little areas in your yard of dirt like this, where your nesting bees can get access to soil. Now, space, that last part of habitat. Also, sometimes really kind of hard to understand. What does space mean? So if you look at this slide, very boring, but I'm going to use this just as a kind of a rough, cartoonish way of trying to represent someone's backyard. Maybe you have a hot tub, maybe you don't, I don't know. But, when the landscape is built, when the house is built, a lot of times in a lot of the new homes, there's just nothing back there. So this is a typical landscape without kind of any plants, without any native plants. You could, if you chose, you could create something like this. Lots of benefits here. I'm using all these little weird shapes. I'm assuming these are all native plants, but I'm just using these shapes just to show you kind of, planting odd numbers and weird, things. But I'm just going to show you a couple of things. You have all this diversity, right? Here you have a human path. Here you have a human path. Here's a human path, a human path. Have a human area here. But then surrounding all of this and all of these little areas where this homeowner perhaps wants to be able to get away with this, all these different variety of native plants. Now you notice it's mostly surrounding the edge, but the interesting thing is if there's an insect over here that could really benefit from a plant or something over here, well, this landscape allows them a way to get over there without, maybe they can fly, but its connectivity is important. Same thing happening here. Here's the water. if you have an animal here that wants to get to a plant here, but doesn't want to fly and needs to be kind of protected, you can kind of create a way for them to get over here. So, just something to think about. These big concepts, these big ecological concepts of corridors and connectivity between habitat, shrink it down into your yard and think about it. Well, what if you're a tiny little bug that walks but doesn't want to get, walk across your yard? Is there a way that that bug can get there, or that lizard can get from one part of your yard to the other without being exposed, to birds as predators, etc.? Anyway, that would be one way you could do it. Maybe that's not for you. So here's a simpler version. Just take your back fence, put in a bed that goes out 3 or 4 feet, and just ring your backyard with some good native plants and put in a water feature. That's a lot lower of a barrier. It's more accessible introduction to native plants. Start small, figure out what you're doing if you haven't done this before. Maybe just take one of them. Maybe take one of these just build you a side bed. Maybe take a corner. Just build you a little bed back here and plant some stuff and piddle. And maybe next year you say, well, I'll do this other corner. And then the year after that, you just kind of connect these. That's what I do. I build pretty much one bed a year until I get my yard, really where I want it. Much more accessible, divides the cost up. You learn as you go. And then when you combine this, if everyone were doing this in their landscape, you would have, here's the generic house and the generic lawn, just using that rimming technique that we talked about. If everybody did that, look, you would create a wildlife corridor that goes around all of the homes and provides a way for wildlife to move from one yard to the next fairly easily. And then once you've put in your habitat, rest and enjoy it, and know that your habitat's there to do work. And just let it do it. Let things eat your plants. Enjoy them. Get out with your kids, your grandkids. Show them what's going on. Show them that what you put in the ground, what they put in the ground, is now actually supporting wildlife. That members of our family that are not humans are benefiting from what we've done. And then you can send in, I'm sorry, I get emotional because my kids, I just love doing that with them, but you can have your habitat certified. A couple of places, National Wildlife Federation will do it. Texas Parks and Wildlife used to. I think that they're not doing actual certifications anymore, but National Wildlife Federation does. So we've looked at what's happening, development occurring throughout the area. We're losing species diversity at a frightening pace. And that has impacts on wildlife that are really predictable. You can pretty much tell what's going to happen when new development goes in. But we can change the future, and we can make the future better than the past. In fact, I think we really need to make things better, because their future is in our hands. With that, I think I'm done with my predetermined things that I'm going to say. And so, Daphne, I'll turn it back over to you.
Oh, wow. Thanks so much, John. Such really great information. And I'm especially glad that we have your seal of approval on leaving our yards messy. I'll try to remember that the next time I have the urge to go out and rake up those leaves, to just prefer the messy look over the aesthetics. I know we all like to have pristine, perfect yards, but it's really great to be that reminder that we can leave them a little messy, and that's actually good for the ecosystem that we want to create in our yard. So thank you for that. We do have time for a few questions. We've got just a couple of discussion points I'd like to have. But first, one of our amazing webinar volunteers has identified your mystery aster as Symphyotrichum lateriflorum, or AKA calico aster. So
calico aster.
Hopefully that turns out to be something helpful for you, and you can now worship that properly with its proper name now that you've learned to love it. Okay, so in the Q&A, we were having a little bit of a discussion about lighting. So how lighting influences insects at night, the color of light, the lessening of light, red light, yellow light, bright red light, LED lights, on all of that. So let's have a discussion about lighting and how that affects our insect populations.
Great question. Yes, it totally affects our, not just insects, but it affects birds, it affects mammals, it affects everything. It even affects humans. And I am not a light expert. And so when you get into, I think it's, oh gosh, because I'm not a light expert, when you get into the various levels of warmth, blue versus orange versus red, the wavelengths, I will fully bow to experts in this room that say this particular wavelength is better than that one because I just haven't studied that. I will say a couple of things about light. Dark is best. Just think about it in nature, right? Now, obviously, not every light every night is dark. In full moon, you can walk around with no light. But so it doesn't have to be totally pitch dark every night. But dark is best. Here's the key, though. I'll give you a real world example. I'm transparent, if nothing. I'm standing right now, facing my front yard, and there's a street light right at the end of my driveway. I have no control over that. So every night, my front yard is bathed in light. So, I have to deal with that. And at the end of my street down here, there's a baseball field from the school. And so even my backyard gets, on baseball nights, gets that light. I don't like that, but it's the fact of, where I live. So it's good to have dark nights, because I'll go back to the fireflies that I mentioned. I love fireflies. They are supremely affected by light. You can imagine that's how they attract their mates, is using light. And so if they're in a bright area, it has a significant impact on them. So beyond a generic dark is good, light at night is bad. So try to be as dark as you can. I really don't know what wavelengths are best and stuff like that, so I can't speak to that.
Well, that's something that we could pretty easily find and include in our resources that we send to people. So that's actually great. So, we talked a lot about the importance of native species, and I think it's implied that native species use less water, but occasionally we get into an extended, really harsh drought, and those are more common now than they used to be. We also get those flooding events that you also mentioned. And so just in your personal yard or your recommendation, supplemental irrigation, how do you handle that in your particular yard, in your situation?
Great question. Great question. First of all, native doesn't mean drought resistant. Bushy blue stem, native plant, gets dry, dead. That's just the way it is, because it likes to have its feet wet. And if it doesn't have its feet wet, then, the obedient plant that I was telling you that's in my pond, it likes to have its feet wet. If I took that bowl out of the water and put it somewhere else, that plant's dead. Native is all get out, dead, right? So the main thing comes with the right native plant in the right spot. So I have Blackfoot daisy, which is very drought tolerant, does not like a lot of water. I have it in one of the spaces that's going to get the driest possible, in my yard. And so I put that plant there. Other plants I know are going to get more runoff from the house and stuff like that. So I have those plants, that can take that there. So native doesn't just mean if it checks the list of being native, you can plant it anywhere. You still have to learn what's its microhabitat, right? So that's a key thing to remember.
Yeah, especially with our Edwards Plateau versus, the Blackland Prairie situation that we have here. We have two very different soil types.
Mm-hmm.
Again, as you say, a native plant doesn't mean it's native to your area, even of your local area. So we want to point out that native means native to your local area, but even that you need to have research-minded viewpoint to where you can look that plant up and see what are its water requirements, because maybe it's a shady native plant and it needs to be in a shade area, or maybe it's a river or riparian species. So, I started my extension career out in El Paso. Obviously, that's the desert, but cottonwoods are native there along the Rio Grande River.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to put a cottonwood probably in your neighborhood. You live up on the mountain somewhere, but if you're down by the river, you would. So definitely it's good to know those very specific things about your environment.
Yes, and I would add on to that, something you don't want to do is you don't want to put a mesic or something that likes, middle of the road water next to something that's xeric in your landscape, even though they're both native, they're both found in the Blackland Prairie or both found in Edwards Plateau. One likes to grow up on the edge of slopes and the other likes to be kind of, in a shady wooded area. So you're really battling against yourself to put those two plants next to each other, because one, no matter which way you go, one's not going to be happy. So you try, and the same thing with sun and shade is you don't want to try to put a plant that needs 6 hours of sun in an area that gets 4 hours of sun, because it's always going to be struggling. I've made those mistakes. Nothing wrong with making those mistakes, but just correct it and move on,
Honestly,
so
I think
those are great points.
that's the only way to learn, is by making a mistake in your yard, because morning sun versus afternoon sun also
Yep.
very different. Full sun in
Absolutely.
Texas, very different than full sun in Michigan.
Yep.
So all of those things, it's just to give our viewers and anyone who has questions, just to give you that support and that confidence that we've all made those mistakes. John and I, everyone on this panel has made those mistakes. And until you make that mistake, you don't really know that plant. You can do all the research in the world, and I encourage you to do a deep dive on every plant that we've talked about that you want to put in your yard, as to what its needs are and how you can meet those needs and how it meets your needs and where to plant it and who to plant it beside. But at the end of the day, you put it in your yard, it doesn't do well there, take those notes and adjust and do something different.
I would even say I use very little, if no soil amendments. I actually live on Blackland Prairie soil. So I'm planting Blackland Prairie plants and I'm planting in Blackland Prairie soil. And so all I do really is I do water it before I put it in to make it easier to work, but I plant it right into the native soil. I don't do a bunch of raised beds and all these improvements and stuff, because actually the native plants don't do well in that. If you live on Blackland Prairie soil, or if you live on really thin, shallow soil of Edwards Plateau, grab the plants that do well there and put those in your landscape. And then you're really not having to fight yourself after that. But anyway, that's, again, right native plant in the right place.
Well, that's the one question that I have, or the one answer that I really have a challenge convincing people of, that they do not need to add amendments to the planting hole. They don't need to add, you can add some compost to the top of the soil to kind of enrich it and build soil structure. But in general, if your plant can't live in the hole that you dig, when its roots grow out of that hole, it's going to start to struggle. So let's just put it in the soil that you have. Let's don't amend that planting soil. That's a soil that hole. That's a really challenging battle for me, has been my whole career. But I'll keep fighting that good fight. Well, thank you, John, for being with us today. Thanks, everyone. That's all the time that we have today. We'll follow up individually with any unanswered questions that we didn't get to. And thank you, John, again. I really appreciate you for being with us today to share your knowledge and your passion for protecting, preserving, and creating habitat for all the amazing wildlife that we have potential to have in our yards. It's such an important message for us all, and one that's critical for the future sustainability of so many species, all of our species, us included, that must coexist in our community for the mutual benefit of us all. Thank you to our attendees for participating. Very soon you'll receive an extensive email with lots of resources, and also a link to a short survey that we'd really appreciate if you would fill it out. That helps us get the funding that we need to continue this series and these amazing programs for you. You'll also have a link to today's session in that email, a list of resources for further study, and links to any websites or source material that was listed by our speaker, along with information about how to contact our gardening helpline and how to subscribe to notifications for future seminars and our Texas Tough Plant series, as well as other AgriLife Extension programs on horticulture and gardening. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and happy gardening.